Coloradans might need to find a new plug. That's because their weed market is in trouble. The industry was once bringing in $2 billion in 2020, but 3 years later, sales plummeted nearly 40%, according to Politico. The magazine writes, quote, "What once was a success story has now left a trail of failed businesses and cash-strapped entrepreneurs in its wake. Regulatory burdens, an oversaturated market, and increasing competition from nearby states have all landed major blows, leaving other states with newer marijuana markets scrambling to avoid the same mistakes." Colorado took in only $282 million in cannabis tax revenue in the last fiscal year, which is down more than 30% from 2 years earlier.
But is the downturn of Colorado's marijuana industry such a bad thing? Take a listen to these stats first reported by the Gazette. There has been a crime rate surge from 2012 to 2022, up 21.6%. Traffic fatalities increased 57% over the past decade. Suicides increased by 23%. Since legislation, suicides among Colorado adolescents ages 15 to 19 have nearly doubled since legislation. And it's important to note the Gazette's editorial board writes that those increases cannot be squarely blamed on Colorado's marijuana legislation in 2014, but the correlation should raise red flags. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has announced they'll move to reclassify marijuana as a less dangerous drug, building on Biden's promise to decriminalize cannabis use and expunge prior convictions. 38 states have legalized medical marijuana, while 24 have legalized the drug recreationally. And I think it's important to note that the editorial board at a magazine is not comprised of people that are fully capable of fledging out statistics all of the time and research. If I go to the beach and I get a sunburn, is it because I ate ice cream at the beach that day and ice cream causes sunburn? No, it's because I was out in the hot sun and sun causes sunburn. So we really have to be careful when we say this thing happened at a similar time to this thing. And so that must be the cause. I'm not sure we can credit, the suicides and the crime rate surge to the marijuana legalization in Colorado there.
Yeah, we should compare it to other states that have not had legalization in the same time period and see if the increases are at all comparable. And that could get us a little bit closer to determining whether or not the legalization of marijuana had some effect on it. But you're right, of course, correlation does not equal causation. But we have seen some new research on marijuana that suggests it's not the sort of harmless drug that many pro-weed advocates would have you believe. I saw a really fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal recently from a top cannabis expert by the name of Bertha Madras, and she talked about some of the negative effects that marijuana can have, particularly on habitual users. She points out that the addiction potential for marijuana is actually significantly higher than that of alcohol. 30% of those who use cannabis have some degree of a use disorder, compared to about 13.5% of drinkers. She also points out that because THC stays in the body and in the brain for longer periods of time, it can lead to long-term brain damage, and also is associated with schizophrenia. A large-scale study last year, she points out, that examined health histories of 6.9 million Danish people between 1972 and 2021, estimated that up to 30% of young men's schizophrenia diagnoses could have been prevented had they not become dependent on pot. And marijuana is worse in this regard than many drugs usually perceived as more dangerous. So although we can't take those statistics in Colorado as gospel or as necessarily caused by the marijuana legalization, I do think it warrants further research to determine really what some of these negative effects have been of this 10-year basically study that we've been able to see in Colorado.
I will say, on the economic front, a lot of the boom and bust we've seen, people purchasing the drug out of state or moving to other states where it's legal now, that is kind of the side effect of Colorado being the first, and people really getting entrepreneurial and capitalizing on the fact that Colorado's the first. Inevitably, if there's other markets for this to be sold, we're going to see things start to equalize, and that might mean businesses closing in Colorado, but they did get much more economic activity in the state than I think they would have gotten otherwise had, they not been first to legalize. The traffic violations it's an interesting one. I'm curious to know if there was any changes to the codes around traffic violations that would also lead to the increase, any increase in the volume of police on the streets there that could lead to the increase as well, or is it just people driving high and getting a little careless? I think we really need more data on that. But that's the one that I see, and I'm like, that could be marijuana. A lot of the other stuff, yeah, we have to have a viable comparison group to see, is there a city similar to the cities where we saw the biggest surge that we can compare to? Are all other variables consistent, like economic activity and changes to civil code and presence of police? There's a lot we would need to do for some kind of quasi-experimental study to really determine that these statistics mean what many people suggest they mean, that marijuana could cause these things. I do believe, though, that a lot of the research around marijuana is important. I think there are a lot of people that are like, you guys are crazy, it's just weed. But as someone who used to smoke a lot of weed when it wasn't legal or regulated, I do believe a lot of the hesitation around it, because I've had experiences with weed that I'm like, this is not a joke to me. I think it affects everyone differently, but I'm definitely one of those people that it's not something I should be doing. I don't think it affects my brain in a good way, and I do experience some of the longer term effects. And so that's just a sample size of one. It's not a big study. It doesn't mean anything, but I hear some of the initial research about the long-term effects of using marijuana and the immediate effects as well. And to me, based on my own experience, I think, yeah, that tracks, and this is worth looking into a little bit more.
Yeah, especially as we see THC levels increase pretty significantly from just a couple of decades ago. What's sold on the market often has 30 to 40% higher THC levels than what our parents were smoking, essentially. And you raise an important point about driving under the influence, because I think even people who support the legalization of marijuana and maybe are not as concerned about the potential risk factors could acknowledge that there is not currently a good system in place for determining how someone is considered under the influence if they've smoked marijuana. Is it a certain level of THC in the bloodstream, and how can we test for that in an efficient manner? And is that even a good way to go about it? Because we know that THC stays in your body for, I believe, up to 30 days compared to your blood alcohol level, which can be tested, and that's exactly how much is in the person's system and that they were recently abusing alcohol. You can't do the same thing with marijuana. So if you're someone who smokes habitually, you might pretty much always have some level of THC in your system. And if you get pulled over, what is the appropriate level for you to be considered to be driving under the influence? And can we even prove that you're technically under the influence, that you're high in some way? I just am not sure that there's a great system available for police to be able to determine that someone was driving high, so to speak. And that is something we absolutely have to be concerned about and wary of when we consider the legalization that's taking place in a lot of U.S. states now.
Yeah, I think what we've seen with marijuana as well, nothing exists in a vacuum. This is within the context of the American healthcare system. I think a lot of people have used marijuana as a way to self-medicate for a lot of mental health conditions, whether it's just, your basic I'm stressed out, it's anxiety, or whether it's something more severe like bipolar disorder, extreme ADHD, extreme social anxiety, even schizophrenia. I think that because it's easier to get marijuana than a lot of these other drugs, because healthcare is so expensive, especially psychological healthcare, to see a psychiatrist to get these kinds of prescriptions that would probably help more than a habitual use of marijuana would, that's a huge fault of the American healthcare system. The fact that people would rather take street drugs instead because they are cheaper and easier and less helpful, and maybe have more long-term negative effects for the community, simply because they don't treat what people are using them for. That's going to have economic effects if you consider these people to be workers as a part of the economy locally and nationally. But it's also going to have effects in terms of the people that are around them, whether it's traffic violations or what have you. And so I think that a lot of the additional research is good, finding a threshold scientifically for what level of THC is relevant is good. Of course, it depends on the person you're measuring because it affects everyone differently. But I think having some kind of scientific measure developed or a test developed to determine when someone is driving under the influence is important, because a lot of times police rely on, you smell like marijuana, let me search the car. And that has its own infringement of freedoms and its own arbitrary application. And I think that's much worse than actually a blood test or something of that nature.
Definitely a lot more to dig into on this topic, but we are out of time. We're going to be back with more Rising after this.